Hi, and welcome back to the channel. In today's program, we're going to discuss the issue of how you are underpaid in your job. Hi, I'm Gerald Marquardt. I'm a certified financial planner. I've been in the industry almost 30 years, and this channel is dedicated to those under 50 years old on personal finance subjects. These are things you should have learned in high school and college, but for whatever reason, they never talked about it. So let's get into our subject today of how it is that you're underpaid. Before we do that, we have to look at a little bit of economic history. Now, kind of stay with me. I know that sounds kind of boring, but it's actually important to our discussion today. In 1776, a writer named Adam Smith wrote a book called Wealth of Nations. Now, in that book, he stated that there are things that wealthy nations do that can promote economic prosperity for everyone. You might argue that part about everyone, but we'll get to that later. He believed in things like personal property, and he talked about how people investing their own money could build up a business, and they would make money in terms of profit primarily off of the backs of their workers, called an excess supply of labor. Now, obviously, there are abuses in this, slavery being one. And by the way, slavery has been going on for centuries with this idea of profit. He didn't believe in tariffs, rather, he believed in free trade. He also believed that the money that individual owners would make would then be shared for the general good of people. He wrote another book about moral sentiments. So 1776, the year that we all understand and know, set into place an economic framework for how economies grow and how they prosper. And therein lies the problem. Because in 1848, someone by the name of Karl Marx came along and wrote the Communist Manifesto. And he pointed out one of the major flaws of this new economic system called capitalism was terrible because it exploited workers and it forced wages down and wasn't fair to the productivity that the workers were producing, obviously. So he proposed a different solution. He proposed that all workers be paid equally and their productive output be given to the state to share that across all of society, that each person would get what they needed along the way. And of course, he felt that this would be a more appropriate way to enhance an economy rather than putting the money and the power and the wealth with capitalist individuals, if you will, that owned businesses. Because in his mind, they were abusive. And of course, it created a system of unequal outcomes, which is exactly correct. Capitalism is a system of unequal outcomes. Communism, on the other hand, attempts to do an equal, equitable resource for all people. Now, if we look in the late 1790s, Alexander Hamilton, you may have heard of him, decided that it would be a good thing to have banks, in particular a central bank, offer bank stocks and bonds, and in essence created the beginnings of the U.S. stock market. In other words, selling equity in firms, such as banks, to people who would want to take some percentage of ownership. And therein lies the issue between the two. Now, don't get me wrong, Karl Marx did praise Mr. Adam Smith's work by pointing out that this idea of division of labor and specialization would benefit by creating new things that had never been seen and would help mankind, actually, in general. But for the most part, Karl Marx argued that the workers of the world had to unite together to fight such an oppression from these capitalists. So let's assume for just a moment that this is correct, that you are underpaid and you're not getting your fair share. And you have to wonder what it is you can do to improve your situation, because obviously you want to make more money to take care of your families and build a future, hopefully of retirement. So there are steps that you can take along the way that you can consider as ways to improve your situation. Now, the first obvious step is to invest in yourself. That means maybe going to get additional schooling, maybe a degree in something, or an accreditation or license that you might have. That's perfectly a good idea, and enhances in front of your employer and maybe future employers that you have more ability than the workers they currently have. On the other side of the coin, you can consider doing some other things. Number one, working harder at your job, doing more things, taking more responsibility. And you do this in the hopes that you're going to get maybe more wages or that you're going to get a promotion. That certainly will add more money to what you're getting. The other thing is that once you've invested in yourself and you're a hard worker, you might consider looking outside of your company and maybe a similar sector of the economy to see what they're offering in the way of wages and things like that. Of course, you want to take benefits into account as well. So there's another possibility that you look at that. Let me give you an example of what we see in the real world today. Electricians, as you might know, may start their own small businesses or work for a small business, residential or commercial. But also it's true that data centers are in desperate need of electricians. And so it's not unusual to see them start bidding for electricians in the general market. In fact, an example was recently given where they tracked some electricians in Texas who had changed jobs 3 times in 1 year and eventually pushed their gross income up to $260,000 a year. Now, you might say, well, that's an extreme example. Maybe, but maybe not. But it's an area that you consider and you see here by looking at the economy where your skill set might be more in demand and pay more than what your current job offers. It's certainly something that you might want to consider. Now, let's go on to another few steps here. You might want to create multiple streams of income. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, here you might consider buying real estate investment trusts, which we discussed in a previous video, that will produce a stream of income to you, dividend growth stocks, which we'll have a future video on, and actually invest in companies that are growing so longer term you can get the appreciation of those companies. In other words, what you're doing is you're no longer putting on an employee hat, but you're putting on an owner hat. This is really important. For instance, if your company, let's say, is publicly traded, they might offer shares of their own stock to their employees, usually at a discount, say 15%. Maybe you should consider that. There, you're putting on the owner hat. And you want the profits. You want to share in those profits that the owners are also getting. Here's a way to make up the gap then between your employee wages and the actual profits of the company. So that's some of the things you want to consider. Now understand, when you're investing in things like this, you're going to take risk. So does the owners of the companies that you're employed with. They're taking risk. They don't know if the venture will continue to be profitable, and that if not, guess what happens? Yeah, they lay off people. And they're doing that to maintain the profits of the owners. Now, you might say that's terrible that they lay off people and do that. But if you were an owner, turned around the other way, you might consider that. You would consider laying off people only if you could still get the same productivity from other sources, such as automation, which certainly has been an issue down through the years of forming the country. We had many inventions along the way that lessened the need for certain skill sets in the economy. It's the way our economy has progressed. Now, you might think that socialism or communism is the way to go. After all, everyone's being paid fairly and equally, fairly according to the state, that is. But the problem with that is that you look at your coworkers and you might say, well, they're not doing much of a job here. I'm the one doing all the work, but I'm getting paid the same as they are. Now, there's the old saying, of course, that they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. You see that a lot in socialist and communist countries. But the real key issue between the two is this idea of means of production. You may have heard that phrase before. The idea that the owners, private owners, own the means of production. In other words, they own the land, the factory buildings, whatever it might be, the raw materials. They own them privately. The difference, of course, is that under communism, the state owns all of that, the factories and such, like land. Now, the question also that might be raised here, who's the better allocator of those assets? Is it the private owner or is it the state? That's something to consider when you're dealing with your issue here of private finance. Lately in the United States, there's been a bit of discussion about that maybe going to a more socialistic or communist way of an economy is better. You might want to look at the track records of both. You might find a very wide divergence of success. Now, before you do all that, you might also consider owning assets, any assets. We've discussed this on previous broadcasts, but think about that. You want to own assets. That's how you improve your financial situation. Debt is not considered an asset. Now, obviously, if you own a home and you have a mortgage, you want to pay it off because the more you pay off, the greater share you have of the value of that asset. You pay it all off. Now, the asset is yours totally, and you have, in essence, money that you can use potentially for the future. These are all ideas for you, how to improve your financial situation. There aren't too many different ways, and you say, I don't like this idea of being an owner. Well, you can do that through real estate investment trust or dividend stocks, being a passive owner where you're not actually out there working. Or you can consider what Warren Buffett said. Until you figure out how your money will make money while you're sleeping, you're going to be working the rest of your life. Does that sound correct? It does to me. So there are ways to get around this in terms of improving your situation. Being a capitalist exposes you to the possibility of very great profits. As we discussed in previous shows, people becoming millionaires off of companies they worked for. Good example of this was Home Depot. Home Depot, when it first started out, offered stock to their employees, and very wisely, cashiers and other employees decided to do that, invest in the company, and guess what? Home Depot took off, and they became millionaires. Now, there's no guarantee of that, of course, but it is an avenue that you would want to explore because the profit incentive is certainly something top of mind to owners and actually everyone. You're looking for a way to profit from your skills. So in this really short discussion on capitalism and communism and things that you can do, I hope you find this of benefit to you. You can sit there and think about some of these things, how to improve your current situation. Now, I hope you like this, that you subscribe and join the channel, share it with those who may need to hear this kind of information. But keep in mind that all of what we're talking about here is ways to improve your current condition. I'll leave you with the final thought. To invest or not to invest? That is the question. Have a good day.